recording. So thank you very much. Really excited to be hosting this WonderCon at Home panel. This is Taking It Personally, Comics and Activism. My name is Andrew Farago. I'm the curator of San Francisco's Cartoon Art Museum, and I'm really happy to be joined today by several of my favorite contemporary cartoonists, and it's a killer lineup. I want to start with, we'll go alphabetically. We've got Darrin Bell, editorial cartoonist and creator of the syndicated comic strip Candorville. Derf Backderf, whose most recent graphic novel is Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio. Thi Bui, creator of the graphic novel The Best We Could Do. And Nate Powell, artist of the March Trilogy and creator of the forthcoming graphic novel Save It for Later, Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. So first of all, thanks everybody for taking part in this. I'm sure it's going to be a really exciting conversation. And my first question for the group is just how's everybody doing? How are you holding up almost a year into lockdown here?
Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I became a cartoonist because I kind of like working alone anyway. So this year has been maybe, in one sense it's been hell, but in another sense it's been maybe my most productive year in a long time. I mean, I'm doing the cartoons you mentioned, but I also started 2 graphic novels that are going to be published by Macmillan. Yeah, so it's a mixed bag for me.
I'm maintaining all right. Our 1-year date for the pandemic here is March 12th. And I mean, really, like, things are just incredibly irregular. And the major thing is that here in my community, like, it's safe enough that we made the decision to let our kids very carefully go back to in-person school. And just the fact that the school and the faculty and staff are doing their thing and doing a good job, and the fact that they're able to actually get some normality and socialization and structure in their lives, that's like the number one thing in my life, is just making sure they have something resembling life when it's safe enough to do so. So, like, my younger kid is about to have her 2nd pandemic birthday here in a couple of weeks, and yeah, just keeps on rolling, one day after the other.
Yeah, I live in Oakland, and it always seems like there's something happening in Oakland. So I think the pandemic, like, on top of world events, has been kind of a lot. And I'm very curious. Like, I always like to get out there and see what's happening with my own eyes. And so I've had to do a lot of COVID tests. So I'm grateful that I can get COVID tests more easily now than a year ago. Recently tested negative, so I feel good.
Good.
Okay, well, I guess I'll bum everybody out. I lost my mom to COVID in October, and
Sorry.
my best friend has it right now, and I'm pretty worried about him. And on top of that, I launched a book in September, right in the middle of the lockdown, which was it went okay, but it was kind of a nightmare. So it's been a really rough year.
I'm sorry, Derf.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I personally think that Kent State for me was the book of the year, and
Oh, thank you.
It killed me that I know you had book tour plans. It was the 50th anniversary, which you only get one shot.
Yep. Yeah. 40 stop book tour and like 3 trips to Europe, all went like that in the space of a week. And I mean, that's just the way it is. I mean, we can talk about this because we're comics creators and we're allowed to be petty about our own circumstances. But in the greater scheme, who cares? But when you work 4 years on a book, you want it to have a good launch, and that's really tough in the middle of this. But like I said, it did okay. I mean, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I was happy with it, and that's all you can do.
All right, and Darrin, you mentioned in terms of you're in your studio, you're at the drawing board a lot. You mentioned that COVID wasn't the biggest disruption in the world to that kind of a routine, but how has this affected everybody? My wife's a cartoonist, and she misses, I don't know if it's little things or big things. She misses going to the coffee shop. She misses our son being at school for 6 hours a day while she works. So how have
Well,
you adjusted to all this?
professionally, it's been fine, but I mean, I miss a lot of things too. I miss driving my son to his ninja class a couple times a week, watching him bounce off the walls with other kids. I miss all the play dates that I used to take him to and that his mom used to take him to. There are a lot of things we used to do that we just don't do anymore. And it's like most of our life is shut down. And I always think every day that I'm lucky because at least we have a backyard, with a play structure for our kids to run out and have some kind of, they could at least pretend they're in a park. And I imagine what it would be like for all the people who live in apartments or, what was lockdown like for them. So, I understood when half the country decided they'd had enough and just wanted to get out and get back to normal. Sometimes I feel like that. Sometimes I catch myself forgetting now that there's a pandemic and I just, walk outside and then I realize, oh man, I didn't bring my mask. And I head back home. So I'm ready for this. And I'm ready. I would love to be able to visit my mom. She lives in Riverside, and we used to drive down there several times a year just for her to see the grandkids and see us. And she's been alone for a year, and it's taking a real psychological toll on her and on everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. And Nate, you mentioned second pandemic birthday coming up. But is your work routine similar to what it was, or is it totally upended?
It was I didn't do any work from March to, I guess, March to the beginning of January, with the exception of finding new routines that would allow me to finish the inking and the editing on Save It for Later. But there were a couple of books that were just about to get started, and the brakes got pumped on everything. So right now, I'm just kind of, as a cartoonist, I, like Darrin, am kind of living a heavenly existence, 5 days a week for 5 or 6 hours a day, because I'm sort of in this limbo of active projects or projects that haven't kicked in yet. And so I'm just like penciling and writing my next fiction graphic novel. And it's funny in terms of like the ways that we find comfort and escapism during all of this. Like my older daughter and we're about halfway through reading the entire Chris Claremont X-Men run together, which has been like a highlight of the last several years of my life, really, to share that and kind of like grow with her. But in terms of making my own books, it's funny because like it's just this fictional story about like time hopping punk band, and it's like, kind of like a space opera that takes place in basements. But so much of it is just fantasy for me because it's just like a bunch of friends just being sweaty and right smushed up next to each other and like breathing on each other. And it's all this stuff that I feel so detached from, that every day, I'm just loving the time I spend with the pages because it has absolutely nothing to do with our current reality.
And Derf or T, how's this affected your your daily routine, your cartooning?
Yeah, it's got pretty much thrown out the door with, with my mom and stuff. And I'm just trying to get back into it. Mostly I've been trying to promote, the book until the end of the year as best I could. And that was all online, of course. And, I'm trying to get back into writing. It's hard, like to come up with something that's not connected to this reality, because who wants to write about this? Yeah, um and I wonder if anybody will want to read about it after it's over and done with, kind of like 9/11. Nobody wanted to relive that, right? So I don't know if anyone's going to want to relive this or not, so I may do an historical piece or something like that. I've got a couple of them kicking around, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm really having it's tough to get back into it. Yeah.
I went through a few phases in the spring because I was working on these comics about COVID that were on a pretty quick deadline. I was feeling good. I was like, wow, I'm actually getting to take a break from traveling to promote and talk at schools and stuff. And since I'm stuck at home, I can actually take on these deadlines. So I was feeling art buff for like 2-3 months. And then I started doing organizing around the 2020 elections and like lost all that art muscle. And then I was starting to get back into it, and I was actually feeling like I had a lot of material to work with because of current events. I was like working on this long graphic novel. It's not a novel, it's nonfiction. It's about like Asian Americans in detention and prisons, and like then the George Floyd protests like really like added this other level to the work. And then this recent stuff around racial tensions in Oakland is like adding this other level. So I feel like I'm like always running to like catch up with current events and incorporate them into the book. But it's also not really good because it's a lot of like thinking in words, and I can't actually fit that many words into a work of graphic nonfiction if I want it to be any good. So it's hard. Like part of me wants to like crank out stuff fast, and then the other part of me knows that I need more time to distill stuff down to something more succinct for this medium. So I don't know, it's a constant back and forth of like getting buff and then getting flabby.
All right. And did you always, your interest in comics and your interest in politics, did those come about around the same time? When did you know this was the type of cartooning that you were going to be doing?
It was when I was doing I thought I was going to be a sculptor in New York, and I kept getting in trouble for making work that the staff said was too narrative. So it was almost flunking out of an MFA in sculpture that made me realize that I should probably be doing something more like comics. So I guess like comics happened because I wanted to tell stories that were more political, and it wasn't happening for me in sculpture 20 years ago.
Okay. And what about the rest of you? Was this the type of cartooning you thought you would be doing at this stage in your career, or at any stage really?
The type of cartooning I'm doing now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I know, because I started out something completely different. I actually started out as a political cartoonist when I was in college, and first couple of years as a pro, and then just burn out on it really fast. And then I did that weekly comic strip for many years, which is something completely different from what I did before and completely different from what I'm doing now. I've only been doing books for the last 10 years. And it turns out I'm better at that than I was at anything else. So that means I basically wasted 30 years of my career. But, sometimes these things happen. But no, I never anticipated that, I would wind up. I mean, you hope when you start on something that, yeah, it's going to be successful. But I never thought that this is what I'd be doing, 30 years ago. No.
It just took that long to become an overnight success.
Yeah, right. Like Elvis Costello said, didn't he say that? And I was an overnight sensation after 20 years working.
All right. Yeah, Nate and Darrin, is this what young Nate and Darrin thought they'd be doing.
Well, I always knew I would be doing this. I didn't have a great relationship with my father, but one thing we shared was political satire. When I was a kid, I mean, one of the biggest laughs I ever saw come from him were when he was watching All in the Family and the Jeffersons, and reading the comics and reading editorial cartoons. And I wanted to make my dad laugh. So, you know, I couldn't go into TV on my own, put on a big TV production on my own, but I could draw cartoons. And so, yeah, I'm doing what I always wanted to do ever since I was 4.
Good ones are always like that, like you, Darrin. I mean, it's just some component in your brain that you're born with. I think you just take to it. It was always too much. I just couldn't maintain it. But well, I'm in awe of those that can.
Thank you. I think you're being too modest, though.
No, I'm really not. You haven't seen my political cartoons, so you don't know.
I was 11 almost 12 when I decided that my path was going to be making comics. But growing up, it was like pre-internet Arkansas with no exposure to the existence of comics that weren't superhero comics. So it took a minute. It really took until I left Arkansas for college to discover that comics could be used to communicate virtually anything. However, I really think that what awakened my social conscience, it made me start to see the world in different ways, was X-Men, combined with thrash metal, which quickly cascaded into punk. And so I think it really, like, in my town in the 90s, the underground punk community was very vibrant. A lot of teenagers and young people in bands, but also, you know, putting out music and making zines. And there was a small zine and book distribution situation happening there that was very DIY throughout the 90s. So at a very early age, I had a lot of nuts and bolts kind of being pieced together. And it just took a few years to realize they didn't have to be parts of different machines. So as soon as I realized that I was no longer interested in superheroes and the things that I was writing about in songs and in personal political zines, that subject matter, that those ideas could simply be made in comics form, that's really when things clicked for me. And I know I'm best known for doing nonfiction comics, but I'm really not a nonfiction comics person in my mind. My home planet is doing weird kind of magical realism fiction, usually with ghosts and some kind of, you know, heartache or whatever. But when it comes to clarity and kind of presenting something with some concreteness, it has gotten easier and easier as my skill set has sharpened to realize, like, yes, there's a reason I keep returning to this, and why half of my projects are nonfiction and they're social, political, and their leanings. So I'm acclimating to it over time.
Remind me to pitch a comics and punk panel. I think you and Derf and
me too. Yeah,
the Hernandez brothers would be a fun.
I love that.
Get together.
Well, my punk scene was better than Nate's.
Well, yours is like OG Cleveland, Akron punk.
Yeah, right.
It'd be amazing.
Okay, so Darrin mentioned his father. Do you have an audience in mind when you're working on a project? Do you have a particular type of reader? Are you trying to entertain yourself, or who's the target for your books and your comics?
I'm a teacher, right? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, who's that for?
That's for everybody. You mentioned your father, but if anybody has a particular...
Well, if you don't pick one of us, Andrew, we're just going to sit here staring at you. So.
Yeah, you're just calling us.
We'll start with T.
Okay, thanks. I think we're maybe all classroom teachers here. So I'm also a teacher by training. Like after I almost flunked out of the MFA, I went and got a master's in education. So did a lot of training around like, who do you teach to? So I think I just like naturally differentiate towards like, you know, like say 3 different groups of people. So there'll be like general audience, but like there'll be like people more like me, and then like people who have like a really beginner understanding of something, and people who have like a really advanced understanding of something. And I'm talking to all of them, and I'm making like access points for each of them. So yeah, it's a complicated way of saying the audience is like really pluralist in my mind, and it's not like an imaginary mainstream audience or anything like that. It's like really specific, but I have like different targets.
I usually write for me first. I mean, you know, if I like it, then okay. I mean, yeah. But lately, you know, I do have like, I don't want to exclude somebody, like, because I've had like this unexpected success with YA readership. I don't want to eliminate that, you know, by just like throwing in gratuitous sex scenes. So I mean, in the back of my head, I do keep that in mind, because, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we do have to sell books, in addition to producing a work that we're happy with. So, you know, it's kind of a balancing act, but that's as far as I go with it.
For me, before starting, or really before March Book One came out, even while making March Book One, I had lived my whole cartoonist life intentionally refusing to consider any potential readership for my books. And a lot of this, I think, was just pure ignorance of how much effort and risk on some levels people play within, you know, libraries, schools, bookstores, comic shops, people sticking up for particular books. I just really, you know, like I had this kind of assumption, like, yeah, I still make books primarily for me, but I was just like, oh, you make the book, the publisher publishes the book, it winds up on a shelf, people obviously wind up reading it at some point, and having a lot of interactions with some of these positive gatekeepers, the people who actually keep the books propped up on shelves. And with March, some of the risk that school librarians have to put up with, especially, you know, here in the lower Midwest, in terms of parental complaints, the threat of losing their jobs, for historical matter, which I had previously never considered to be controversial in the slightest, until I saw the human consequences and risk on the shelf end. That sort of forced me into a position in which then all of a sudden I was reckoning with the historical content. And so, like, being like a Southern boy raised by baby boomer Southerners, I also brought an assumption that like the content within the pages of March was, you know, largely something that people had, you know, a decent level of awareness about. And Andrew Iden fortunately kind of like shook those scales of blindness off of me and was like, no, dude, they don't know. Trust me, they don't know. So a lot of that was a process of re-education. And like, for Save It for Later, it's an interesting position because it's a book for adults, and it's not a parenting book or an activism book, but a lot of it is about how to equip my kids as 4 to 8-year-olds through the course of the book with the tools they need to process what's going on and be involved with it on their level. And so a lot of it is me as a character being read by adults, but trying to speak about very complicated issues in a very simple way. It's going to be weird and interesting to see how that is received once the book comes out in a month, because I think it would be really easy to fall into a dismissive attitude about some of that, about oversimplification, so a lot of my creative attitude or my self editing has to do with, whenever possible, pointing out that that's what I'm doing, or putting myself in the position of being wrong or being an idiot as a character within the pages of the book, and trying to kind of offset some of that skewed perception of who is reading the book and why and at what level.
Okay, and Darrin, you've got probably the most, you've got a pretty mainstream audience in that you have newspaper readers and people who go to the newspapers online versions. So what what kind of audience feedback do you get for your comics? We'll talk about that a little bit.
I get, well, first of all, I get less feedback than I used to because of social media. People used to love to email me when they were upset, but now, people tweet about it, or they post it on their own Facebook or whatever. So every once in a while, I mean, people tell you never Google yourself, but every once in a while I'll Google something if I thought that I did something that's going to be controversial. And I'll usually get the horrible responses I was looking for. I get a lot of responses from, the past few years, I've gotten more and more comments by white supremacists, like people who are just bold and blatant about it. Before the last president, people used to couch everything in euphemisms, but now they don't. And every once in a while I'll look at it because it gives me material for more cartoons, because I have some characters in my comic strip who represent those kinds of people. But for the most part, I just turn it off now, because it's just a little too toxic, and it could seep, it seeps into you, and things are bad enough with COVID. I found that I'd rather spend what little free time I have playing with my kids than reading what some random neo-Nazi has to say about something I drew.
Is it better that they don't hide who they are anymore, or is it worse, or does it not matter?
I used to think it was better, but I think it desensitizes people. The more we see about it, the more we see of it, the more we're going to see of it, because it spreads. I mean, that's why, I mean, this is America. So, and we're cartoonists, and the First Amendment is something that we've clung to as a religion, basically, our whole lives. But I can understand why so many European countries had rules against Nazis and neo-Nazi speech, because they saw firsthand how it escalates, and we're starting to see that now. So I don't know. I don't think it's a good thing that they're so emboldened.
Yeah. So
I'd rather they continue to be ashamed of it.
So yeah, on that subject of history repeating itself, I thought of with March, with The Best We Could Do, with Kent State, reading those, I wish that they didn't feel so relevant today. So a lot of the issues that they touched upon from 40, 50, 60 years ago are still, we're still dealing with them today. We're still addressing them today. So was that something that was going through all of your heads as you were working on these books? Like, this is, it's the past, but it's we're still dealing with all these issues right now.
Yeah,
I'd say,
for sure.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
without a doubt. Go ahead, T.
No, you go.
I'd say that over the course of doing March, like those 4.5 years of drawing, we were also touring and speaking during that time actively. between 2012 and the middle of 2016. And so we were watching the temperature rise and watching this hard right shift occur in real time. So by the time we got to March book 3, we sort of had to have a regular check-in on the narrative perspective of John Lewis's caption self in March book 3, basically being like, okay, you guys, this being all three of us, as well as our editor, Lee Walton, a lovely human being. But basically checking in with each other, being like, do we need to weigh in on this particular situation in the pages of March? Each time and every time, our conclusion was that if we do our job right at telling this first person historical account, we have to trust that the reader who lives in the same world as us will really have no option but to make those connections themselves. But also what was important was that we kept having that conversation, that we were keeping up with what was happening and how that was unavoidably being reflected and echoed within the pages of the history we were putting down. With Save It for Later, it's a little different because I intentionally, when I started doing it, I wanted it to be like a thin volume that I could finish quickly, that was very personal, and in a lot of ways switched back to kind of like making a zine that had more to do with subjective experiences during the previous administration, that I thought, like, things were happening really fast, and I thought that very quickly we were losing the sense that there was enough bandwidth for people to talk about things that were more subjective, more personal, more emotional in terms of like the emotional toll of authoritarianism. And so I did it privately, quickly, and then eventually it congealed into a slightly larger project. But it was always kind of a rolling operation that was reacting to what was happening in real time, but was also trying to get ahead of what was happening in real time.
Do you think you did it? Did it feel successful?
Yeah, in that way, yes. The biggest challenge when completing the book, like I did a final chapter in the month of August 2020, and it basically, essentially just encapsulating February through August, and back and forth between the editor and myself. Basically, it was an eternal question that was sort of rocking the boat by a couple of degrees each direction in terms of weighing in on the presidential race, weighing in on specific larger political figures, etc. Whether or not an afterword would be necessary, like cooking up 2 afterwords or epilogues depending on the victor of the election. And so starting in about May 2020, I was like, I see where this is headed from a mile off. The only way to circumvent this is to try to communicate through the book, to make a book that can stand regardless of electoral outcome. And for Save It for Later, that was my prime concern, was that virtually like none of the problems are going to go away because of a change in administration. It obviously makes a huge difference, but to like, I finished the book with that in mind. I needed to make a bulletproof final chapter that was basically a push forward, anticipating that virtually all of the problems of 2015 through 2019 were going to survive into the 2020s. And in that way, in that depressing way, I think that I stuck the landing.
See that. I think for me, dealing with history from 40 plus years ago was nice because it gave me the luxury of taking my time. I'm slow. I call myself the slowest cartoonist in America, so that nobody else can. And like, I wish I could do what Darrin does, but I'm just not that fast at processing and then drawing it. So for me, it allowed me to take my revenge on like very old representations of Vietnamese people and the Vietnam War, which I feel like it's still like a perennial, like it's still a problem, right? Because like you may have seen Rambo and all those Vietnam War movies a long time ago, but they still shape the way that you like think about the actors in those stories, right? Like the Vietnamese people. And so like taking beef with something from the past helped me take my time in crafting a story that like put the humanity back into it. And I think dealing with current events, that's one of the challenges, is like when you're just dealing with like really quickly moving media representations and you're trying to tell this big story fast, sometimes you take shortcuts maybe with the humans in the story, and you paint stereotypes or cliches maybe when you didn't mean to. So that's something I'm still trying to grapple with.
I started Kent State the summer before you know who got elected. So no one's mentioned his name, and I don't want to break that spell, so I'll just refer to him in that way. So you know, it was because these books take so long to come together. I mean, you know, it's not like Darrin's process where he comes up with something and, you know, a couple hours later, bam, it's out there. I mean, that's the power of, you know, a true political cartoon, that you just have that immediacy. Whereas with books, I mean, they take so damn long. I took 4 years to do Kent State, and that was a hard deadline. I mean, I was really busting my hump the last year, working at an almost Nate Powell like pace at that point. But you know, I thought it would be relevant when I started it, because you know, the thing about history is you know, so much of it's forgotten, and that's why we keep repeating it. So I thought it would be relevant. I had no idea it would be as relevant. You know, that spring and summer, it was supposed to come out in spring 2020, and then it got bumped to fall because, you know, because of the lockdown. And I mean, in Europe, you know, all my friends there, I mean, you had the Gilets Jaunes protests and all these, the police crackdowns there and all this stuff. And I was like, my God, this is just like, you know, this is just like 1970 in America. And over here, we didn't have that yet. We had the anger, but we didn't have millions of people in the streets. And then just like that, you know, the BLM protest started, and suddenly, holy cow, it's happening here. And then January 6th on top of it. It was really kind of overwhelming. I mean, I'm not pretending that I'm, you know, have any kind of wisdom that I could have anticipated that. I mean, I watched it with as much horror as anybody, but I thought the book would be relevant. I had no idea that it would be as relevant as it unfortunately became. And thank God it didn't, you know, become a mirror of what happened. On a small scale it did, but not on a large scale. I think we were very close.
Yeah, I thought I was going to be talking about like current refugee crises when my book came out, and I didn't think I would be talking about kids in cages, for example, or like not taking any more refugees. I never imagined that would be on the table.
Right. That book came out before that guy
came out
too, right?
March 2017. So.
Oh, 2017.
Yeah. So yeah, I came out talking about Trump.
Right. Oh, you said his name. You broke the spell.
So, well, I have the cup, so it's already there. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, and so Darrin, we talked about some of the, you know, less pleasant feedback that you've gotten. But I want to know, have you heard from people who whose minds you've changed, whose perspectives on these issues have changed, like when you know, anybody unexpected, like probably not any white supremacist just saying like, well, that flipped the switch for me, but what are some of the happier or more unexpected positive reactions you've gotten?
Well, to be honest, none of the positive reactions are ever unexpected, and neither are the negative ones. If you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, my answer would have been different. I mean, I used to get a lot of people emailing me saying, you know, I used to think one way, but, you know, you forced me to see it from another perspective. But more and more what I've seen is people are just incredibly polarized. And I know when I do something critical of one politician, I know it's going to get a whole lot of positive reaction from people who oppose them. And when I do something about the other side, like when I do a cartoon critical of Biden, those same people who for 4 years have been telling me what a genius I am, go onto my Facebook page and tell me I blew it, I'm a Trumper, I'm horrible. You know, it's really disillusioning, the response you get, because it kind of makes me think, you know, we all have one thing in common, and that's that we can be horrible. So, you know, ask me in 4 more years. Hopefully I'll have a more uplifting answer about the feedback.
Everybody thinking.
Oh, we're just thinking, wow, that's real. Yeah.
Oh, what was the question? Changing minds?
Yeah. Are you changing hearts and minds with your comics, or are you preaching to the choir?
Nah.
No, I don't
Well, I
think
don't
you can
think
do it
I'm
alone.
preaching to the
Yeah.
choir, but you know what I do is not political cartooning. So, and in fact, you know, I've done 4 books, and maybe 2 of them are about politics, a particular part of politics, but it's not political cartooning. I mean, it's just not. So I'm not really, you know, I don't know. I think I like to write about things that maybe people don't know about or know the details about. Like when I did my book Trashed, which was about, you know, this garbage, this worldwide garbage problem told through the eyes of garbage men. I mean, people don't know about that world. So, and I do, because I was a garbage man when I started out. So I had that insight and in the research and told a story that people didn't know about. So in that way, you know, maybe I changed minds just because I depicted something that nobody had ever thought about before. But as far as actually changing minds, yeah, I don't think I have that power.
Nobody does it alone though, right? Like Nate, you're talking about librarians who, you know, take a risk to make sure that the book's available. I think it does make a difference to the kids who then have access to the information, right? And it's all these little moves, it's all these little differences, like between not having it and having it. Like somebody had to do that. So I don't know that any of us can really like change that much alone just by making stuff, but it's like part of an ecosystem of people uplifting like what you said because you said it in a way that they wish that they could, you know, and then other people sharing it, and then maybe teachers are teaching it and like creating conversations around it. Like that's where the real work happens.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that it's, in general, it's just not as binary. Like the idea of being moved and changed by reading something or hearing something is not as binary as we would like it to be. It's just like it's not that clean or linear. You know, working on March and the reception of March on many levels is just very complicated, with like huge swaths of people from different walks of life, why they're reading March, what their concern is that brings them to the book, you know, and where they're taking that from there. So like whenever I talk about impact as a result of March, the most concrete thing I have really is like more personal, subjective impact. Like when March Book 2 came out, that was the book where like 2 weeks later, I was talking to my parents on the phone, and it was book 2 that really rocked their world. That sort of, as they grew up in northern Mississippi, both graduated from high school, you know, in 64, 65. And like for white Southern baby boomers, man, they're still unpacking a lot of that baggage. And one reason why I felt that my skills were necessary to get to work on March in the first place was simply reckoning with my Southern generation's level of education and miseducation about the movement, you know, from the mouths of the previous generation, not realizing how much energy had gone into avoiding their roles, you know, their passive roles in the segregated South for decades and decades. So like conversations were started, and like the luggage they unpacked as a result of March Book 2 in terms of talking about complicity and ignorance, meaning that in the most literal sense, ignorance of things that were happening 20 miles from their house, kickstarted a lot of things. With Save It for Later, I'm curious. I don't know. I feel like there's going to be a strong emotional response, simply because, oddly, I think this book is going to be at the forefront chronologically. It's going to be in this first wave of people making work that is actively reflecting on the previous 5 years, without making a big deal about looking back and reflecting, because it's not like, you know, the major problems are all still with us and in many cases are worsening. But in getting to sort of clear some dust off of the multiple corners that we've kind of had to compartmentalize and push away, I feel like that's going to have impact. For the most part, most of the comics I read are with my kids. And so seeing the like revolutionary impact the March Trilogy had on my elder daughter, you know, starting at age 4, and then we finished book 3 at age 7. And we've done multiple reads through, but the ways that, you know, like that's sort of what kicked off my making Save It for Later, was realizing that any of this content, when presented with the mindfulness of where someone else is coming from and delivering it at their level, you know, a 4 and a 5-year-old can process some really complicated stuff when they see its impact in the community or the neighborhood around them. So as far as changing hearts and minds, I think like that's where most of my energy is as a cartoonist now. It's not like I'm making comics for my kids, but it's in seeing the impact from just like the raw, unfiltered perspective of young people who just don't have time to compartmentalize and be unimpressed by things.
Can I just say I loved book 2 for introducing a cast of characters who are behind the movement. I think that's really important because we have a culture that really loves to like put one person on a pedestal, and that's what you learn about. And then like, so that's your idea of like the civil rights movement was like one man, but to understand that no, it was a system of people who worked together, and they sometimes had very different ideas from each other. That's important because that's like what movements are going to be made of now.
Yes. And that became one of our central conversations when doing the trilogy. Once we got to book 2, like you can actually, the conversation is actually captured on the cover. It's divided into 2, and the top half of the book 2 cover, which features the burning Freedom Riders bus outside of Anniston, Alabama. Like I had completed the cover of the book. We signed off on it. We were all good with it. But Congressman Lewis, a couple months later, he came back to us. He was like, you guys, I don't feel so comfortable having that image on the cover of the book, simply because it was during a 2-day period in which he left to go interview for a Peace Corps position, and he came back to rejoin the Riders. And he was a few hours away when the bus was attacked by white supremacists. But it forced the conversation where he's like, I wasn't there, and I don't feel comfortable like centering this whole narrative around me when right there on the cover, that's not my memory. But then it forced this realization that like, if we're really telling the story of the movement, the part of the story of the movement is what happens when it reaches, you know, this crucial density, so that it's basically surpassing the ability of anyone, even at the center of the movement, to be present for all of it. And so once we had sort of arrived at that eureka moment, we're like, it's okay. Like, the history is the history of this mass movement that no one can be around for all of. And then we're like, so this is our new mandate. We are now escaping the primacy of one person's narrative and decentralizing it as the movement itself was supposed to be decentralized.
Well, that's why I told Kent State the way I did, through the eyes of actually 5 people, the 4 people who were killed and then one of the guardsmen, because no one person was present for the whole thing, and that was only 4 days and on one campus. But still, it was a very complex, moving, this moving event. So how do you approach that as a storyteller? And that's, so I decided to tell it through those 5 different perspectives and try to weave that together into one cohesive narrative, which was a hell of a job. I mean, I'm surprised that I pulled it off.
That was masterful, like, especially
you.
with the unreliability of some of the most essential moments.
Right.
Like, you were able to set up the reader's faith in you, the cartoonist, to deliver that unreliability in a way that we still trusted.
Well, that's the power of our particular art form, is that we're able to depict that in a way where that ambiguity is still there, but we still show the event, just by the way we handle the way the scene is portrayed. And that's something you just learn by doing. I don't think I could have done this book 4 books ago. I needed to learn how to, I don't want to use the word master. I needed to learn the word, what word am I looking for? At least to get competent enough at what I'm doing that I could pull it off. But yeah, it's the same thing that you were, how do you portray these events in a way that is honest and is based on at least somebody's reality?
Yeah, that last chapter of Kent State, I had the hardest time getting through. I grew up with that. As an Ohio kid, I grew up just knowing the numbers, just knowing four kids were shot.
But you didn't see it, and that was I
Yeah,
never hesitated about that. Yeah, I mean, it packs a wallop. I don't spare any of the violence, and that was by design. Going into it, I knew, and I told my editor, this is what I'm planning. And the nice thing is, even when some of the relatives of the victims of the kids who were shot read the book and contacted, I told them, look, if you're going to read this is what it's going to show, so you should be prepared for that. And the sister of Sandy Scheuer, who was one of the girls who was shot, she said, oh, you have to show it. It's so important that you show that, because it's never been shown before, and this is what our art form can do, and everyone here, we all do it. We can conjure up that imagery, and it's, as long as it's not based, as long as it's honest and it's not based on just making stuff, almost used a bad word, sorry, making stuff up. If it's based on facts and honesty, then I think it's that's the power of our medium.
Great. And yeah, we're approaching the 1 hour mark, so we should wrap up. But what's everybody looking forward to? We'll end on a positive note. What are you looking forward to a year from now? So spring 2022. What are you hoping to have in the works, or what's keeping you going?
I want to hug my friends. Just want to hug my friends.
Keep hearing about these roaring 20s. They sound fun. So hugging and dancing and just, a lot of partying. That sounds good. I'm ready.
I want to see my mom hug her 3rd grandchild. He doesn't even remember her. It's been, he's not even 2. Yeah, I want to see him look into her eyes and hopefully form some kind of memory that he'll be able to carry with him the rest of his life before it's too late. And Derf, I'm really sorry about your mom.
Thanks, man. Thanks, man. I'm looking forward to seeing live music again. You know, going to a show, band I really dig. I mean, gosh, it's been so long. I can't even remember the last one I went to. And just going to a diner or a coffee shop and just hanging out with friends. I mean, just little things, nothing big, just the little things. That's what hurts the most, is not having those.
Yeah, and I've got to say, like, all the griping I did a year and a half ago about comic conventions, about having to know exactly how much 50 pounds worth of books in a suitcase is.
You miss them now, don't you?
You know, the $10 convention hot dogs and all of that. You know, I'd take it back in a second. So, you know, it's a good way to wrap up WonderCon at Home 2021. Hopefully, we're all doing this in person for WonderCon 2022 and beyond. But thanks to all our amazing panelists. I could have talked to any one of you for an hour easily. But thanks so much, and thanks for watching.